Mara counted 47 knots in the ceiling timber on her wedding night. She had nothing else to do. The king sat across the room in a high-backed chair, fully dressed, watching the fire the way a man watches something he doesn't trust. He had not spoken since the ceremony. He had not looked at her since the vows. When the clock on the mantel struck midnight, he stood, straightened his coat, and told her she was free to sleep. Not an offer, a dismissal. She listened to him leave. She listened to the door close. She lay in the center of a bed so large it felt like a field, and stared at the ceiling, and counted knots until the candles burned down to nothing. In the morning, his chair had been moved 2 inches closer to the bed than it was when she arrived. She didn't mention it, neither did he. She counted it anyway. Her name was Mara, and she was the second daughter of a family whose name had once meant something. Now it meant debt, and a house with a leaking roof, and a father who used the word opportunity when he meant sacrifice. She had arrived at the palace 3 days before the wedding with one trunk, her mother's pearl earrings she had never liked, and the specific silence of a woman who has already finished grieving the life she is not going to have. The treaty had been signed before she finished reading it. She folded it in half, then in half again, until it was small enough to fit in her pocket. She carried it with her for the first 6 months. She never opened it again. The palace was enormous in a way that felt like a warning. Long corridors, high ceilings, rooms that went dark at the edges, even in full daylight. The housekeeper, a woman built like a judgment, and dressed like one too, walked her through the rules on the second day. Don't enter the east wing. Don't ask about the marks on his forearms. Don't light candles after midnight. Don't say his name during the change. Mara listened carefully. She asked one question. What happened to the others? The housekeeper paused. Not long, just long enough. They were afraid of him, she said. He knew it. That was all. Calder, king of the Northern Territory, was not a man who explained himself. He had never needed to. Rooms rearranged themselves around him when he walked in. Conversations stopped. People made decisions faster in his presence. Because standing still under that gaze felt like something you could only survive for so long. He was not cruel. Mara understood this early. He was simply a man who had been built into a weapon before he was finished becoming a person, and he had never quite figured out what to do with himself in the in-between hours. He had scars on his forearms. She noticed them the first time he passed her in the corridor without speaking, which was every time he passed her in the corridor for the first 2 weeks. The scars were old and layered, the way you get from something that happens regularly rather than once. She did not ask. She paid attention to his hands instead. They were large, and they were calloused, and when he sat at the head of the long dining table surrounded by his council, they rested completely still on the surface in front of him. Everything about him was still in a way that took enormous effort. She could see the effort. She did not think anyone else at the table could. She did not know yet what to do with what she saw. So she watched, and she waited, and she counted ceiling knots. The first real thing that happened between them happened at dinner, 3 weeks after the wedding. A courtier said something about her father's debt, loud enough for the table to hear, the kind of comment designed to remind everyone in the room of exactly what she was and where she had come from. The king went still. Not the careful stillness she had been watching, a different kind, the kind that precedes something. The table held its breath. 40 people stared at their plates. Mara reached across the table and placed her hand flat on the back of his, in full view of all of them. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her ears. His hand under hers was trembling. Not with rage. She did not understand that yet. She said nothing. She simply kept her hand there, warm and steady, until the moment passed, and the conversation slowly, carefully, started back up around them like water finding a new path. The courtier was relocated to a posting in the northern provinces within the week. Nobody mentioned it. She did not ask. But later that night, she sat in her room and thought about the trembling, not the anger he had been reaching for. Something underneath it. Something that had been pressed down so long it had no name left. She thought about it for a long time. Oh, the chew. The east wing. She went because of a sound she couldn't place. Not a howl, something lower, rhythmic, like someone counting. She found him on the floor, back against the stone wall, fully dressed, shaking. His eyes were open and focused hard on a point about 3 feet in front of him, as if the point on the floor was the only thing keeping him in the room. She stood in the doorway. Every sensible thought she had said to leave, to walk back down the corridor and pretend she had seen nothing, and wait for morning, when he would be the careful, controlled, silent king again, and they could both go on not talking about it. She walked in instead. She sat down next to him on the floor. In her good dress, which she would regret later, and did not regret in the moment. She did not touch him. She did not speak. She picked up a small brass candle holder from the side table near the door and began examining it the way you examine something when you are trying to give a person next to you the room to exist without being looked at. She turned it in her hands, looked at the base, looked at the handle, looked at the way the light moved on the surface. 3 minutes passed, maybe 5. The shaking slowed. He did not look at her. "You shouldn't be here." His voice was rough, like it had been somewhere difficult and come back changed. She set the candle holder down carefully on the floor beside her. "I know," she said. She stayed. He did not talk about it directly. Not then, and not for some weeks after. But he started appearing in places she was. Not intrusively, not in a way that demanded anything. He would be at the far end of a room she entered, looking at books or out windows. He would leave a chair pulled back at the table before she arrived, angled just slightly toward her. Small things, things that could all be coincidental. They were not coincidental. One evening he sat across from her in the library and said, without looking up from his papers, that the beast had come when he was 16. She did not move. She did not change her expression. She kept her eyes on her own book. His father had called it a gift, he said, a weapon, a tool of the crown. He learned to use it that way. He got very good at that. He got worse at everything else. He said this last part looking at her hands, not her face, like he could only say it sideways, like direct was a direction he had not been allowed in a very long time. She did not fill the silence after. She had learned by then that his silences were not empty. They were load-bearing. The full moons were difficult. She learned their shape over time. 3 days before, he became quieter, which was impressive given how quiet he already was. 2 days before, the east wing was locked. The night itself, he was gone before dark, and the palace staff moved through their routines with the practiced calm of people who have long since decided that some things are simply part of the weather. She lay awake the first several full moons and listened. There were sounds in the forest that she chose not to name. In the morning after the third one, she found wildflowers placed outside her door. No vase, stems still dirty, placed like someone who had never given flowers before and was working from a second-hand description of how it was done. She put them in a water glass on the windowsill. They were dead within the day. She didn't throw them out for a week. The night it reached for her, she was in the east wing. She had gone there on purpose, which she understood was not sensible. She had gone because she wanted to understand something, and the only way she had ever learned anything was by going toward it rather than away. The beast was already there. It was larger than she had prepared herself for, not because she hadn't known, but because knowing and seeing are two entirely different things, and she felt that difference very completely in her body in the moment that she saw it. It stood between her and the door. Every instinct said run. She stood still. She looked at it the way she looked at things she was trying to understand. Carefully, fully, without flinching. Not because she was not afraid, she was, deeply, her hands were shaking inside her sleeves, but because fear had never actually told her anything useful, and she had long since stopped letting it make her decisions. The beast took one step toward her. Stopped. Its head dropped. The sound it made was not a growl. She would not be able to describe it to anyone who asked. She would also not be able to stop thinking about it for the rest of her life. It was the sound of something very large that had been alone for a very long time and did not know what to do with the fact that someone had stayed. She reached up slowly. She placed her hand against the side of its jaw. She held it there. He left things after that. A book, placed on her chair in the library with no note. The fire in her rooms always lit before she returned at night, even when she came back later than expected. Her tea at the temperature she hadn't realized she preferred until it was already that temperature. He added a second chair to the east wing, identical to his own. She sat in it the first time she found it, and looked at his chair across from it, and thought about how long it must have taken him to find one that matched. The palace was old, and the furniture was old with it. Someone had looked. She said nothing about having noticed. He said nothing about having looked. Ah. She started staying through the full moons. Not outside, not in the forest, not anywhere dramatic. In the east wing, with her book and the matched chair, and the lamp she was allowed to light early in the evening before midnight, made it complicated. She sat and read, while outside the window, the night did what the night did, and in the morning, he came back through the east wing door, with leaves in his hair and exhaustion in every line of his face, and found her still there. The first time, he stopped in the doorway and looked at her for a long moment. You waited. Not a question. He was too surprised to make it a question. She turned a page. I had a good book. He sat down in his chair. She kept reading. He closed his eyes. The fire was low by then, and the room was warm and quiet, and outside the wolves had already gone back into the deep part of the forest. He was asleep in minutes. She read for another hour before she set her book down. She looked at him in the low light, the scars on his forearms, the careful architecture of a face that had spent years keeping everything off of it, the way his shoulders, even in sleep, held some last small amount of tension, like he had forgotten how to let the last of it go. Well, she thought, that happened. A year passed. She learned the palace the way you learn any place you live in long enough, not by memorizing it, but by belonging to it. She knew which corridors were cold in winter, and which ones the morning light hit best. She knew the housekeeper's real opinions from the ones she delivered in her official capacity. She knew that the king took his coffee wrong by any reasonable standard, and had never once questioned it. She knew which sounds in the east wing meant he needed company, and which ones meant he needed her to sit close enough to touch but not quite touch, and she had learned the difference without being told. He had learned things about her too, that her silences were also load-bearing, that she found small objects interesting in moments of difficulty, the candle holder, a particular button she had once turned between her fingers through an entire council meeting she had not been supposed to be present for, and had attended anyway. That she did not say fine or okay, and when she said well, it meant she was processing something large. He had started listening for it. One evening in late autumn, almost exactly 1 year after the wedding, she was reading in the east wing when he came in early, still human. The moon was not yet full. He sat down on the floor against the wall instead of in his chair, which was new. She looked at him over her book. He looked at the fire. I don't know how to do this, he said. Any of this. The parts that aren't the wolf and aren't the king. She considered that. She set her book down on the small table between the chairs. She moved from her chair to the floor and sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. She looked at the fire with him. I don't think you have to know how, she said. I think you just have to keep doing it. He was quiet for a long time. And you'll be here. Also not a question, but a different kind of not question than before. Before he had been too surprised. Now he was asking the only way he knew how to. She leaned her shoulder slightly into his. I have a very good book, she said. The night of the next full moon, she sat in the east wing and read. He came back before sunrise, which was earlier than usual. He came through the door slowly, human, and the shaking was less than it had been the first time she had found him, considerably less. Not because anything had changed about what he was, but because something had changed about what he wasn't alone in. He sat on the floor in his usual spot. Breen. She turned a page. His breathing leveled out the way it did when he stopped managing it and let it find its own pace. His eyes closed, and after a while, in the warm and quiet of the low fire, he tipped sideways, and it was her shoulder he landed on. She turned another page. Outside, the wolves had gone quiet early. She did not mark the significance of this. She did not think about what it meant that the forest had settled before dawn, or that the beast had come home before the night was finished, or that the man now resting against her shoulder had, over the course of 1 year, learned how to be tired in front of another person. She just read. The fire burned low, The palace was still, the wolves were quiet. She read, until the light came through the eastern window, and when it did, she closed her book carefully, so as not to wake him, and she held it in her lap, and she stayed.